Story Garden Publishing presents the fantasy novel Unbound Life by Marie McCue and Riley Rookhouse. Illustrations by Amy Agassi. Audiobook narration by Percy Wright. Prologue. Mina. The brutal weather fit Mina's mood as she killed her best friend. The carriage rocked and swayed against the evening storm, battering the prisoners within as it bounced down the narrow mountain pass. Lightning tore through the gray sky, striking close enough to spook the horses. They reared, whinnying in distress, and sending clots of dirt spraying into the air amidst the driving rain. Thunder followed, an ear-splitting boom that made the wagon tremble on its wheels, but she didn't flinch. In fact, she didn't look up at all, not even as the downpour pelted in through the barred window, soaking her tunic and trailing rivulets of freezing water down her spine. She didn't balk at the electricity that filled the air, making her skin tingle and hair stand on end. She didn't jump when another bolt of lightning lanced down from the sky, as if tossed by some angry god. She was too busy ending Darcon's life. Physically, it was simple, almost frighteningly so. His round face had already gone from a deep red to mottled purple, his eyes wide and frantic. His stout legs pedaled madly as he writhed and thrashed like an animal in a trap, his breath a reedy whistle as she crushed his throat. Her hands, bound by heavy steel manacles, began to ache. Gritting her teeth, ignoring the shadows that swam before her eyes, Mina shifted and dug her elbow into Darcon's thick neck, leaning in with as much force as she could muster. It wouldn't be much longer now, not with all her weight on his windpipe. Perhaps, under different circumstances, Darcon would have broken free, but his own hands were shackled together as well, caught in the same steel cuffs that prevented them from using magic against each other. She kept him pinned against her knee for a good measure. There was power behind his spasming limbs, and she was growing tired. A muffled gurgling escaped Darcon's throat, but between the horse's panic whickering and the exploding thunder, no one outside heard his choked cries. Fighting the pain in her wrists, Mina struggled to maintain her grip as she watched her fellow passenger's life slowly drain out of him. His movements were subsiding, his eyes rolling back in his head as he twitched against the floor, his lips blue and his skin as pale as bone. A last croak left Darcon's lips, and his chest stopped heaving. Trembling, Mina let go, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. As the adrenaline wore off, revulsion took its place, guilt, too, more than she could ever remember feeling before. The world around her blurred as her eyes clouded with tears, and she reached for the blindfold that hung around her neck, desperate to return to the comfort of darkness. No, she couldn't. She would need her sight for what was coming. Her chest lurching with sobs, Mina fell back against the wall and surveyed the corpse in front of her. The sight of him, his neck dark with bruises from her elbow and his eyes spotted red with burst blood vessels, made her stomach turn over. The dancing shadows were gone, but that was of little comfort as the weight of what she'd done fell on her. It had been easy. That was the worst of it. She couldn't bear to look down at her shackled hands, couldn't bear to stand up. It was all she could do to suck in a breath, return her gaze to the now dead Darcon, and begin to count the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 1. Mina. 4 weeks earlier. Come on, Darcon, Mina teased, wiping sweat from her brow. You promised me a challenge. So I did, her opponent growled, lunging forward to launch a kick at her midsection. He was deceptively quick, given his size, but Mina was quicker, dancing nimbly away without bothering to deflect the blow. She resumed bouncing from foot to foot, her eyes sparkling in the light of the waxing moons overhead. The sky was an ocean of stars, free of clouds that would dampen the initiate's connection to Celestriona. Their patron goddess would be in power tonight, and although the first moons of the evening weren't full, there was no denying their presence. Clear nights like this always stirred something within Mina. Deep down, in some secret primal place, although the order of Celestriona lived and died by the heavenly bodies, Mina sometimes found herself contemplating that vast blackness around them, that endless void between the stars where unknowable things lurked. Focus, she reminded herself, coming back to the present. It's not too late to concede, she taunted Darcon, executing a perfect crescent kick. It glanced off his shoulder, making her fellow initiate grunt. Point, Master-Disciple Lennox called, a smile playing on his lips. He stood a short distance away, with Darcon's mentor, Master-Disciple Nagus, beside him. Together they observed their sparring students with vested interest. All around the training yard, other such pairs of initiates were exchanging blows under the watchful eyes of their own instructors. Calls of points and fouls filled the spring air. Uniformly, shaved heads bobbed and weaved all around, punctuated by the nods of the equally bald master-disciples as their students scored points here and there. Despite the occasional cold breeze brought on by the exposure, the night itself was warm, and the disciples practicing on the mountaintop were sweating. Concede? Never, Darcon fired back with a smirk of his own. His expression of heated determination was enough to send a shiver down Mina's spine. Reeling, she lurched backwards, having to resort to an open palm block to deflect his strike. She was still leading 4-2, but she could not afford to become complacent. Careful, Mina, Master-Disciple Lennox called, as if reading her mind. Keep your distance. Don't let him clinch you, or you'll end up spending the evening in the infirmary. Easier said than done, especially when her partner had such a devastating fire in his eyes. But Mina did as instructed, and flitted away from her opponent. Her mentor had a valid point, of course. She would never be the wall of lean muscle and pure strength that was Darcon. Easily 50 pounds lighter and standing under 5 feet tall, she was a waif in every sense of the word. At 16 years old, she wasn't holding out much hope for a sudden growth spurt, which meant she had to play to her advantages: speed and agility. That's right, Darcon called as she danced backwards, praying she wouldn't crash into another pair of sparring initiates. Just keep running. This isn't a confined fight, Mina reminded him. I'll climb up the walls if I have to. She faded a left skip kick. Darcon took the bait as she'd known he would. This was where she was most in her element. Elegant, graceful, moving like water, supple as starlight in fog, allowing her innate sense of calm to guide her movements. Despite her light-hearted barbs, what she had cultivated was much more poised, a fighting spirit, one her mentor referred to as balanced and collected. That was the goal of any disciple, wasn't it? Darcon overextended, aiming a blow at her exposed abdomen. Mina blocked his punch, taking the opportunity to land a perfectly executed knife strike. Point, Master-Disciple Lennox announced again. Darcon growled in frustration, and Master-Disciple Nagus' mouth pulled into an irked frown. Focus, Darcon, he instructed. You're too off-center. Find your roots and steady yourself. Grimacing, Darcon planted his feet, staring down at Mina as he waited for her to make her move. Not wanting to disappoint, she darted forward to block the downward strike she knew was coming, landing a rather decisive jab to his sternum in the process. Before Lennox could even call another point, the low drone of the horn reverberated across the training area, announcing the end of the first event in the tournament. 6-2, Mina said, panting. She and Darcon dropped their guards, their match concluded, and bowed to one another. That last one didn't count, Darcon argued, rolling his shoulders to loosen them as the initiates began to disperse. Besides, it wasn't fair to begin with. You used half the field, and you're faster than me. And more than a foot shorter, Mina pointed out. In the time since he had started at the temple, Darcon had grown like a weed, while she had remained the size she'd been when she first arrived. Hard to believe that was 4 years ago, she thought, frowning. While the memory of being shipped off to the Order had lost most of its fangs, time had dulled the edge. It still brought with it a melancholic ache. Leaving her home and family behind to join the monastery hadn't been the sad part. Her life before had been one of misery. Nothing quite destroyed your spirit like an empty belly, and part of her still wondered if that constant malnutrition of her childhood had stunted her growth. Under different circumstances, perhaps she would have ended up strong and strapping like Darcon and so many of the other temple initiates. True, her days spent working the family looms and ten keeps had taught her deftness, and coordination, but she would trade that for a sturdy psyche any day. Her real sadness, the sadness that sometimes had her tossing and turning in her bunk until the first bell of the night rang out across the mountaintop, came from knowing that she might not last at the temple. It was no accident that she and Darcon, the two lowest-ranking initiates in the order, had been paired off tonight. The threat of expulsion hung over her like a dark cloud, never quite abating, even when things were good. Her parents had too many mouths to feed as it was. If she did not have this life, she wasn't sure she would have any. "You okay?" Darcon asked, giving her a gentle nudge. By now they had fallen in with the rest of the crowd, drifting toward the wrestling field for the next event in the tourney. Not even the initiate's breathless exhaustion was enough to dull the buzz of excitement that filled the air. Tonight's tournament had been stirring up the energy among the disciples for weeks, and even if it was just a ceremonial event, it broke up the stargazing and meditating quite nicely. "I'm fine," Mina replied, forcing a smile. She had become something of an expert at that over the years. "Just basking in my victory." Yeah. Darcon looked down at her, flapping his hand dismissively, but although his mood had soured, his frustration didn't seem directed at her. As if to prove it, he gave her a lopsided grin. Mina's stomach clenched, as if he'd actually landed one of those earlier punches, and her heart raced, as if she climbed all 440 steps up the mountainside without stopping. One would think she would have stopped fancying him after they'd been friends for so long, but one would be wrong. If anything, her interest only seemed to have grown stronger over their years of training together. Being stuck at the bottom of the pecking order fostered more than just kinship, it seemed. "I'm sensing some jealousy," Mina teased, having to crane her neck to get a good look at him. "You may be looking down on me right now, but when we're done, you'll be looking up at me on the leader sheets." "Enjoy it while it lasts, Min," Darcon shot back, his smile broadening. "Grappling is next, and we both know how that's going to go." Master-disciple Linux fell into step with them, his stony expression belaying the mischief in his eyes. "Perhaps it was a mistake to pair you with Darcon, Mina," he remarked. "Maybe you should be taking on one of the older candidates." Mina couldn't help preening a little at that, even if it was mostly meant to throw Darcon off balance. As it turned out, not even the master-disciples were totally above good old-fashioned goading. "We'll see," Master-disciple Nagus said as he caught up to them, but there was no real optimism in his voice. "Then again," Linux continued, undeterred, "maybe it's for the best. At least, this way, he isn't at risk of being hurt by one of our less discipled students." Darcon snorted as they arrived at the wrestling field, where the other initiates were already spreading out, still in their previous pairs. The only open ring left was on the outskirts of the training area, where the temple grounds gave way to craggy cliffs and sheer talus-covered slopes. The mountain winds battered relentlessly at the stone wall behind them, and although the other disciples' voices still carried to where they were, it felt emptier there. Somehow. Lonelier. Moving to stand opposite Darcon, Mina rolled her neck in preparation for the next round. He dwarfed her, and there was no question he had the advantage in close-quarters combat. She wasn't about to start complaining now, though. The Temple of Celestriona, like many of the other monastic orders in Heavenfall, based their instruction on skill level and not on age or size. All that mattered was one's ability to keep up with the rigors of the training. If you couldn't, you left. It was that simple. The horn sounded. The initiates knelt, and the grappling match began. Dropping to the ground, Mina and Darcon faced one another, each calculating their strategy for a moment as they waited for an easy opening. When none came, Darcon made the first move, lunging forward to grab Mina by the shoulders. Being this close to him always left her feeling a little lightheaded, but she set her jaw and focused on staying upright, seizing his upper arms and leaning into the force he was exerting. That was her first mistake. Even putting her shoulders and back into it, it was only a matter of time before Darcon bowled her over into a partial guard. With her arms extended to keep him from gaining full control, Mina had no room to block him with her legs. "Bad idea, Min," Darcon said, grinning, although he was breathing hard. "Now you're the one making this too easy." Instead of responding, Mina risked letting go of his arms to jam her legs up against his chest and better protect herself from a full guard. "That's it," Master Disciple Lennox called from her side of the ring. "Don't forget, your strength is in your lower body." "Right." Mina grit her teeth, finding her center of balance. There was no way for him to budge her now unless he wanted to risk giving her the upper hand. But if she could just flip him. Her second mistake. Trying for a roll. She got her legs around his ribcage and wrenched to the right. But at her size, she didn't have the leverage, and he overpowered her. "Point," called Master Disciple Nagus. Mina's heart skipped a beat. It would have been easy to tell herself it was all just for sport, but when had that ever really been true? There was a reason so many monasteries taught their practitioners the arts of war, and it wasn't mere self-defense. Connecting with one's patron deity was as much an active presence as an active prayer. It required you to be grounded in your body, in tune with your sensations, reactions, and breath. Combat was a tool of communion, crucial to gaining the physical understanding required to progress in this faith. At least, that was what the master disciples all claimed. "Look on the bright side," she told herself as they reset for the next bout. "At least you don't have to wear armor." The Order of Zarus made its disciples learn how to fight with glaives and spar in full chainmail. As hard as her size often made things, it lent itself to the unarmed combat of Celestriona's disciples. How much does one of those halberds weigh? Probably almost as much as I do. Darcon retreated as the next round started, and this time, Mina was the one to attack first. Jamming her shoulder against his chest, she tried for a throw, but Darcon saw it coming and pulled back just enough to set himself up for another full guard. Mina struggled to get out from under him, but with no room to maneuver, he had her pinned again in seconds. "Point," Master Disciple Nagus called. They continued like this for 4 more rounds, and Nagus called 4 more points. When the horn finally sounded again, Mina was gasping for breath. "Nice try," Darcon said, reaching down to help her to her feet. "I was just wearing you down," she panted, accepting his hand and springing back up. Her muscles shook from the exertion, and her dark skin shone with sweat under the silvery moon's light. "You would have gotten tired of beating me eventually." "I'll never tire of giving a good beating to a small thing," Darcon retorted. He grinned, just like Warren when he's alone in his room. "I hope he thinks of someone other than me when he's alone in his room." Mina laughed, trying to hold on to the humor of the moment, but inevitable disappointment crept back into her. And there it was again, that fear. Would tonight be the night when they decided to send her home? Would the temple elders at last catch on to the fact that she didn't belong? That she was here for nothing more than food and a warm bed? Or worse, think of me, Darcon replied, again with that lopsided grin. "You're not small enough," she griped. "Nearly 6 foot and still with room to grow. No wonder you won that round so easily." Darcon rolled his eyes at that. "Right. I forgot. It's only a matter of skill when you're the one who's winning." "That's not what Mina started. She shook her head. He had a point, and they both knew it. But that didn't ease the sting. Although the moons Incord and Jascord were beginning their descent toward the horizon, Brocord was on the rise and Lowercord wouldn't be seen for at least another 30 minutes. It wasn't quite 2 in the morning. There was still plenty of time for the last event of the tournament, which is arguably the only one that mattered. It wasn't long before she and Darcon, following the herd of other students, found themselves back out in the forecourt, where the temple observatory stood. Even at night, it was a marvel. Its tower cut a dark silhouette into the gray sky, and the bronze dome that housed the telescope gleamed in a way that seemed almost living, as if it were burning with its own internal fire. The outbuildings stood around it in a proud circle, paying silent homage to the beauty of the tower and the power that it represented. In the training yard, beyond the observatory, stood a line of solid stone slabs mounted on sturdy wooden racks. There was one for each of the initiates. Pairs wouldn't be necessary this time. The stones were thick and rectangular, about the size of pillows, rounded in the middle before tapering down at the edges. Although Mina was under no illusions that they would feel feather-stuffed when struck, her stomach lurched at the sight, and although she'd known this was coming, she couldn't hide her dismay. There was no getting around it. This was the ultimate test of an initiate's martial connection to Celestriona's power. To break stone with one's bare hands required drawing on the goddess's will, something Mina had never managed to do in the 4 years since her arrival at the temple. Oh, she had tried all right. She had spent countless nights beating her hands raw under the stars, but to no avail. Her fellow disciples had long since mastered it, all except Darcon, another reason they shared the lowest ranking on the boards. The other initiates often spoke of the strange beauty that was the goddess's voice, the euphoric rush of strength that came when they called upon her endless power. But Mina knew no such connection, and it was finally coming back to bite her. This tournament wasn't just being held for fun after all. It was a means for the senior disciples to evaluate the neophytes' progress, and another opportunity to be cast out if they felt she hadn't made the cut. Mina shivered. Her palms had grown clammy. "Relax," Lennox advised her, putting a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You'll do fine. Breathe into your punches and remember Celestriona. Channel her power correctly, and the stone will break itself." "Right," Mina said, squaring her shoulders and letting out a long breath. Inner calm, always, she turned to Lennox. "Don't worry, Master Disciple. I won't let you down." "You don't have to worry about letting me down," her mentor assured her. His smile faltered. "Although for your sake, I hope you'll succeed this time." "That would be nice," Mina acknowledged weakly. She would settle for anything other than finishing last. Given her performance in grappling, she couldn't afford to fail now. "You'll do fine, Mina," Lennox repeated, laying a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He had been astronomically patient with her ever since she was assigned to him, but even now she couldn't shake the idea that his words of encouragement were for himself more than anything. Nodding, Mina turned and scrutinized the line of waiting initiates. There was an unclaimed place next to Darcon, who was already sizing up the stone block, mounted in the air between a pair of thick wooden beams before him, as if it were a living opponent. He fiddled with the silver star pattern medallion around his neck as he stared, his brows pulling together. Was he as worried as she was? She drifted over to him, not allowing herself to be intimidated by the fact that, while the rock slabs were situated roughly at chest height for the other students, hers was nearly level with her face. There was no point in panicking now, though, so she focused instead on getting her breathing under control. "Reach out to Celestriona," she told herself, closing her eyes. So she did, doing her best to focus on the moon and the stars, and not the void around them. The connection was strong up here, and the energy was so raw she could almost taste it, as tangible and all-encompassing as the air they breathed. In the distance, the horns sounded. All around her, the other disciples began striking their stone targets, each activating their own connection to the celestial power above and around them. Almost immediately, the low hum of energy built in the air, filling in all around. Celestriona was with them. All she needed to do was reach out and borrow her power. But Mina felt nothing. Growing worried now, Mina slowed her breathing and fought to push away her fear. Inner calm. Her eyes flew open and she lashed out on an exhale, striking with perfect form and willing the divine energy to take hold. Pain erupted in her knuckles. There was no change in the stone, no rush of power, no euphoria, no otherworldly wonder. There was just hard stone and cold wind and darkness. A frustrated mule escaped her. This happened every single time. She was following the instructions perfectly, doing exactly what she was supposed to. Where was her patron goddess when she needed her? Why was it always so difficult to harness her powers? Inner calm. She tried again, this time with her other fist, and the pain brought tears to her eyes. Sucking in a breath, Mina recoiled, and she didn't need to look to know that she hadn't even put a crack in the rock. Matters of discipline came easily to her, but this mental block, this resistance that she couldn't quantify was always the same. Sometimes she couldn't even be sure whether the resistance came from her own mind or from the goddess herself. There was no explaining it, not even to Master Disciple Lennox, If the elders declared her a heretic, she would be tossed out of the order and into the cold wilderness without a second thought. This time, when her fear swallowed her faith, Mina couldn't shake it off. This would be when it all finally caught up to her. She would die in the streets, alone and starving, after 4 years of dedicating her body and mind to the order. She would lose her friendship with Darcon, lose the safety and security she had come to take for granted. But there was something else there too, above the fear. That same nameless emotion that came to her whenever she thought too long about the darkness of the night, or the space between the stars. It took hold of her in the absence of Celestriona's guiding hand, and in it, Mina found power. Tentatively, she pulled on that power, and it flowed into her like sweet, dark wine. Her training took over, and she couldn't think twice now, not with her flesh itself seeming to vibrate, that strange and terrifying energy sinking into her skin, her muscles, her very bones. It was raw and primeval, and some part of her knew there was no controlling it. All she could do was channel it, and hope that it went where she needed it to go. Mina struck out with her fist again, and there was no pain this time. A crack appeared in the stone in front of her, and although she was faintly aware of vibrations reverberating back up her arm, it was nothing but background noise compared to the beautiful song of the night's darkness that now welled inside her. Breathing in and out, she continued to punch, finding a rhythm. She was doing it. By the goddess, she was actually doing it. Somewhere off to the left, one of the other rocks crumpled and crashed to the ground. The master disciples applauded the first student to destroy their stone. Mina didn't look. She couldn't afford to lose focus, not now that she had finally found her connection to Celestriona. With each blow she landed, the spiderweb of cracks on the stone grew. Around her, other rocks cleaved in two, prompting more congratulatory remarks from the observing instructors. Mina kept at it, not sure how long it had been, not caring until she noticed that silence had overtaken the surrounding crowd. The only sounds were the rhythmic thumping of her fist against her stone, and Darcon's labored breathing as he struggled next to her. They were the only ones who had yet to break their rocks, she realized. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her, threatening to interrupt the tenuous connection that she had achieved. Steady, steady, she reminded herself. It's not a sprint. Even if it was, a little. The ache in her arms had increased to a dull roar. Punching upward was exhausting, and not even the power she'd been granted could numb her muscles forever. She was flagging, the rate of her punches slowing considerably. And there came a moment when she was on the verge of yielding. No, not now. Digging in her heels, she sucked in one last deep breath and leaned into the otherworldly energy that fueled her. This time, when she struck, Mina didn't open her eyes, letting the punch land where the universe willed it. One last pulse of pain shot up her wrist, accompanied by a shower of dust, and the next thing she knew, the stone lay in two halves at her feet. It wasn't a clean break by any means, but it was broken all the same, and that was what mattered. She'd done it. With her concentration interrupted, the celestial power flitted away from her, disappearing like a moth into the night. She was sorry to lose it, but not enough that could dampen her relief at having succeeded. Triumph surged through her. Somehow, some way, she had gotten through to Celestriona, and if she had done it once, then she could do it again. Staggering away from the rock, Mina glanced in Master Disciple Lennox's direction. Smiling, he gave her an approving nod from where he stood beside Master Disciple Nagus, who looked considerably more distraught. Only then did she venture a glance at Darcon, who had yet to put a dent in his slab. It didn't take a master's eye to figure out why, although the air crackled with divine power around the tall initiate, and the world around them was bathed in its pale glow. Her friend was failing to channel it. The energy currents twisted and danced around him, calling to mind the swirling surface of a starlit soap bubble. But they weren't settling into him, the way they were supposed to, leaving his strength unaugmented. Brows furrowed, eyes narrowed to slits, he grunted with exertion as he struggled to shatter the rock. He had yet to find a rhythm, and even at his size there was no breaking the barrier needed. Sweat poured from his face and neck, blood oozed between his knuckles and trickled down his wrists. Mina stifled a grimace. He was flagging. Darcon appeared to dig deeper, letting out a growl of frustration, but that only upset his timing further. It was his anger that was the problem. It had always been the problem. The divine energy surrounding him was beginning to dissipate, none of it making contact with either him or the stone. Mina couldn't bring herself to look away, pressing her lips tightly together at her friend's obvious discomfort. The stone slab was now smeared with blood. Around them, initiates and instructors watched, winced, and waited. At last, Master Disciple Naga stepped forward. "Enough, Darcon," he said, his firmness masking his disappointment. "That's enough. You're done for the evening." Darcon's face contorted into a snarl. "I can do it," he spat, not retreating from the stone. "Look at your hands," Nagas pointed out gently. "They're mangled. You'll break every bone in them if you don't rest." Darcon scowled, looking like he was about to argue, but a glance down at his clenched fists only proved his instructor's point. He'd taken the skin off his knuckles, and his hands were a swollen mess of blood and bruises. Without Celestriona's favor, injuries were all he was going to get. Cursing under his breath, Darcon stalked away from his target just as the horn blared, announcing the end of the tournament. The other students began to disperse alongside their mentors and partners, bound for the observatory, the library, or the dormitories. Some murmured, and more shot backward glances at Darcon and his failure. Cassandra, the first initiate to have broken her stone, beamed amidst a gaggle of other disciples, doggedly trying to enjoy her victory despite the misery of watching a fellow student fail so spectacularly. Mina fell in wordlessly next to her brooding friend, wondering if it would be better to leave him alone. "Well, you beat me," Darcon groused, but the fight had gone out of him. He was staring down at his wounded hands, flexing them idly as if he could somehow get the magic right just by looking at them. "I didn't beat you," Mina pointed out. "If you want to get technical, Cassandra was the one who beat you, and she beat the rest of us too." "Yeah, well, at least you broke your damn target," Darcon continued listlessly. "You shouldn't take it personally," Mina told him gently. "It's just—" She shrugged her shoulders. "You have to learn to be serene, I guess." As soon as the words were out, she realized how uncouth they must have sounded. The last thing he needed was for her to rub salt into the wound, especially when she had been anything but serene just a few minutes ago. Darcon should have been upset by the reply, but he didn't sulk, seemingly too exhausted to do anything but go back inside. Sighing, Mina followed the tall boy back in the direction of the dormitory. At least he hadn't told her to get lost, but that did little to ease her embarrassment. Why do I always have to put my foot in my mouth? They were just in front of the dormitory doors when one of the other initiates, the very one they had been joking about earlier, an older human boy named Warrid, brushed past, bumping Mina with his elbow as he went. Glancing back at her over his shoulder, he called, "What's it like coming second to last, lambkin?" Mina blinked, but didn't take the bait. The fact that she was human was plain for everyone to see, but given her size, comparisons to the short race of lamb-like people were inevitable, and proof that Warrid had no imagination. Surely he could have come up with a cleverer insult after 4 straight years of goading. Besides, she was still riding the high of her success. Not even snide remarks could put a damper on the pride she felt. Giving Warrid an indulgent smile, Mina replied, "I'm not sure you should proclaim your obsession with sheep people all the time. People are going to get the wrong idea." "What's that supposed to mean?" Warrid demanded, turning around so he was blocking the door. "You got something to say to me? If you do, you'll have to stand on a chair just to look me in the eyes when you speak." Mina swallowed the put-down, prepared to glide past and ignore him, but Darcon was already muscling between them, glaring daggers at the other boy. "If you've got a problem, Warrid, then say so. Otherwise, get out of our way." "What's this?" Warrid asked, his eyebrows shooting up in mock surprise. "One derelict defending another?" "You know, I think Mina has a point about your sheep thing, Warrid," Darcon replied. "I hear Master Violin won't let you in the goat barn anymore." "What's that about?" "You really want to start something, Darcon," Warrid spat, crossing his arms. "That rock back there did a number on you, and it couldn't even fight back." "That's enough," Mina interceded, grabbing Darcon by the arm and giving him a firm tug toward the side entrance. "It's not worth it." Darkon's eyes darted from her to Warred for a moment, and then he backed up a step, reluctantly, allowing Mina to lead him away. Their fellow initiates' grating laughter followed them as they retreated. "He shouldn't talk to you like that," Darcon stated, his eyes on the ground in front of him as he walked. "Believe me," Mina replied, "I've heard worse than lambkin. Not that anything's wrong with lambkins. I find them cute and fluffy." When he didn't reply, she gave him a sideways look, annoyed that he hadn't even registered her comment. "Not that I'm interested in petting one or anything. We'll leave that to Warred." Still no response. "Do you think he's got a stuffed animal he uses up in his cell for that?" she prompted. "I'd hate to think about the color the wool is at this point." Again, no reply from Darcon. Although she could still sense his indignation, Mina couldn't help a small smile. Not because of his aggression, but because, for all his faults, her friend had never viewed her as anything other than an equal. Perhaps it was because they had begun training around the same time, or perhaps it was because, like her, he had always struggled to find his place in the order. Either way, there was no denying his warmth toward her, and that, above all else, was what set her heart fluttering in her chest whenever he was around. "At least I have one ally in this place," Mina thought, falling wordlessly into step beside him as the final moon of the night began to rise over the walls of their home. Chapter 2. Darcon. The chamber was silent, save for the soft scrape of the wooden spoon against the dish as Darcon scooped up a bit of porridge and held it out to Elder Sloke. The older man fought to sit up in bed, his wrinkled brow furrowed in concentration, as he struggled to lean forward and accept the food. The pitiful sight soon became impossible to watch for any longer. Clearing his throat, Darcon pulled his chair closer and spooned the porridge directly into Sloke's mouth before easing him back into his mountain of pillows. The elderly man grunted, closing his eyes as he focused on getting the food down his throat without choking. "It's strange," Darcon thought, watching him with deep fascination. "You could be the strongest man in the world, and time will still cripple you in the end." The young man had never understood it, this wasting away into the nothingness of old age, waiting for a death that never came. If you had to go down, it was better to go down fighting. "You could at least pretend to enjoy it," came a familiar feminine voice from over his shoulder, tinged with the characteristic accent of the civil lands. Turning, Darcon saw Mina standing in the doorway of the infirmary. He couldn't help but grin. The petite girl was just about the only friend he had in this place, and she never failed to pull him out of even his darkest moods. Mina was pretty, if short, with dark skin and even darker eyes, and there was a youthfulness about her that was only compounded by her small stature. She was bald, as was tradition. Hair and beards were considered taboo in the order, a worldly distraction from service to the goddess. That had never made much sense to Darcon, but he too kept his head shaved. One less thing to grab onto if a fight ever got ugly. Out there, beyond the temple walls, where men spilled as much blood as monsters, fights always got ugly. His friend gave him a distant smile in return, but her eyes, as they so often did, spoke of sadness, of suffering, that Darcon could never quite grasp. Elder Sloke finally swallowed his porridge, grimacing and shooting a glance Mina's way. "Least they could have done was add some sugar," he griped. "It's damn near inedible. If they're trying to starve me to death, they're doing a good job." Despite the crankiness in his voice, there was a twinkle in his eyes. "They're not trying to kill you, Elder Sloke," Darcon told him, as he scraped up another spoonful of gruel. "They don't give us sugar, either. Believe me, I wish they did." "Bah!" Sloke flapped his hand at him. "Poison, then. The sooner they get me out of the way, the sooner they can replace me with one of those blockheads from the observatory. More interested in sticking their noses in books than watching the stars, the whole lot of them. Mark my words, both of you, when I go it won't have been an accident." Mina chuckled, shaking her head as she glided into the room. Master-disciple Nagas was always droning on about discipline, about being in your mind when any sensible fighter should be in their body, but even Darcon couldn't help a touch of envy at his friend's composure. "You shouldn't say that about the master-disciples, Elder," Mina chastised, pulling up a stool next to Darcon. "You trained most of them yourself back in your day." "For all the good it did them," Sloke gave a haughty sniff. but he grinned when he saw Mina's reaction. Although he was missing most of his teeth, and his face was as wrinkled and soft as a prune, there was still a hint of the man he'd once been, a fearsome fighter, worthy of making critical decisions about the future of the temple and its initiates. Most master disciples never lived long enough to become elders themselves, or to shoulder the responsibilities that came with the role. Years are the best teacher, Nagus was always saying. As feeble as Sloke was now, his voice along with those of the other two elders carried more weight around the monastery than anyone else's. The master disciples could bicker all they wanted about how much of the tax endowment should go to stocking the larders, or whether or not to convey with the Temple of the Emerald Reach. But at the end of the day, the three elders had the final say. The politics of it all were enough to make Darcon's head spin. He hadn't left his brother behind and come all the way to this desolate mountaintop to pay attention to the infighting of old men. Funny how they never mentioned that part when they spun tales of the Order's power and glory. Becoming a celestial dragon, of course, was the main selling point. It had been for him, at any rate. "Here," Mina said, motioning for the spoon. "Let me." Darcon obliged, passing her the dish of gruel and leaning back in his chair. "Thanks. My hands are killing me." He glanced down at them and grimaced. They were black with bruises and speckled with scabs. An overt reminder of his failure at the tournament 2 days ago. Considering how much they ate, it was a miracle he hadn't broken something. But that would have been a small price to pay to avoid the humiliation of failure. A fresh burst of frustration ricocheted through him at the memory, and he curled his wounded fingers into throbbing fists. He was a strong fighter and an even stronger grappler. In any other setting, his hand-to-hand combat skills would have earned him a formidable reputation. Instead, he was the laughingstock of the temple, all because he couldn't get Celestriona to listen to him and break the damned rock already. It was made all the more awful because he knew exactly what the master disciples were saying behind his back in the aftermath. It's that blasted temper of his. He has no self-control. Sooner or later, his anger will get the better of him. The worst part was that they were right. His temper had him rolling his eyes during meditation and scoffing at his mentor's corrections during practice. But it was also what made him such an effective combatant, never willing to give up and bend the knee. Yet the stone still stood in the training yard, this very moment, judgmental and unbroken. There were some things that mortal muscles just couldn't budge. It wasn't fair. "Yes," Elder Sloke remarked. "I hear you were quite the sight the other day." He was making a point of ignoring the spoonful of food Mina had extended to him. Darcon scowled, reaching up to finger the silver amulet of Celestriona that hung around his neck on a delicate chain cord. His sister, Chansey, had given it to him before his departure from Breakmore, claiming it would bring him good luck. Some luck it had brought him so far. "I made a damned fool of myself. The master disciples made me sweep the staircase as punishment. I was out there all day for all the good it did. It'll be covered in pine needles again by tomorrow." Sloke just laughed. "Relax, boy. Best be thankful you could even compete. At least you're not stuck twiddling your thumbs in this dusty old sick room." "That's exactly why you need to eat," Mina insisted, nodding at the porridge. "Mistress Geraldine says you need to get your strength up." "So, this torture was her idea then? And she's supposed to be a healer," Elder Sloke snorted. "I guess I know who to have ousted next." Mina blinked, her eyes going wide, but Sloke gave her a gummy grin. "I'm joking, of course. Someone has to set the broken bones and administer the smelling salts around here." Squaring his shoulders, he straightened up in his bed. "Let's get this over with." Darcon watched as Mina carefully fed Sloke, one hand on his neck to keep him steady, but there was only so much she could do to help once the food was in his mouth. Witnessing the concentration required for him to do something as simple as chewing was disconcerting, and as Sloke choked down the porridge, Darcon found himself pondering the future. Years from now, when today's master disciples had long since passed, leaving their corporal forms to reincarnate as celestial dragons, what would become of him? Would he master his connection to Celestriona and ascend? Or would he be left like this, a feeble wreck, drooling into his dinner bowl? The thought sent a twinge of dread through him, and once again he looked down at his battered hands. Elder Sloke began to sputter, great heaving coughs racking his body. Lurching forward, Mina clapped him on the back as he regained his breath, wordlessly passing him a napkin. Hands shaking, Sloke wiped the spit and stray gruel from his face, taking a moment to compose himself before heaving a weary sigh. "You shouldn't have to put up with this," he said, shaking his head, although it was unclear to whom he was speaking. "Tending to a dying old man who can hardly eat, let alone get out of bed." Mina bit her lip. "You're 97, she pointed out. "You're the oldest human member of the Order by, what, a decade? You've earned the right to stay in bed." Elder Sloke waved her off. "Tell that to Snowthorn. He's going on 200, and he still goes out every sundown to run his drills." "That's only when he isn't hibernating," Darcon interjected. "I'm sure you wouldn't be having this problem if you could take months-long beauty naps." It was only thanks to their periodic slumber that tundra elves could live as long as they did, but the constellation still felt hollow, mocking even. No one needed to point out the obvious truth that Sloke was nearing the end of his life. One look at his gnarled bones and feeble frame could tell you that. "You'll outlive us all," Mina said, attempting to break the awkward silence that now hung over the room like a grim onlooker. She set the bowl of porridge aside and picked up a fresh cloth to help the elder wipe his face. "Just you wait." Sloke chuckled. "You're too kind to me, both of you. How you're able to make an old grouch like me laugh is something I'll never understand." At least he still has his humor, Darcon thought, smiling in spite of himself. "You're selling yourself short again, Elder Sloke," Mina insisted. "You're the most respected disciple at the temple." The old man leaned back, his eyes drifting up to the ceiling. "Sure," he groused. "You could say that, I suppose." "Temple elder," he snorted. "A consolation prize no matter how you dress it up." "I'd rather be up there." He raised a gnarled finger to the window, and the night sky beyond where thousands of stars twinkled. For a long moment, none of them said anything more. Finally, Sloke dropped his hand back to his covers. Glancing from Mina to Darcon, he pressed his wrinkled lips together, looking pensive. "Have either of you noticed how few master disciples make it to my age?" Darcon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Elder," Sloke gestured around the empty infirmary, "we're not meant to grow old around here. Why do you think that is?" His expression hardened. "Why do you think I'm so old?" Darcon frowned, exchanging a look with Mina. He wanted to speak up, if only to get the ugly truth out of the way. But he couldn't bring himself to. "You're so old because you failed to ascend," Mina replied at last, in a small voice. "You never fulfilled your duty to Celestriona. You're still alive because you never became a celestial dragon." "And there it is," Sloke said, his voice softening as he sank deeper into his mass of blankets. Mina's face fell, and Sloke reached out to pat her hand. "You don't need to pity me. Gods know I've done enough of that myself. Just promise me you won't make the same mistakes I did." Mina lifted her head, blurting out the question before Darcon had the chance. "What mistakes were those, Elder?" Almost as soon as the words were out, she backpedaled. I mean, that wasn't... I'm sorry, that was out of line." The old man smiled, unfazed, and gave a soft sigh, his gaze returning to the ceiling and its mural of the constellations. The moonlight streaming in through the window bathed him in a ghostly glow, and Darcon was sure he had never seen a living being look so much like a corpse. "It was my fault," Elder Sloke said at last, so quietly that he was nearly impossible to hear. "I was nothing special. There was no excuse, no sob story. My constellation scroll told me what I needed to do, as they do for everyone, but..." He shrugged his bony shoulders. "I thought I could work around it, you see. Put it off to avoid leaving the temple. I had other, more important earthly matters to attend to, or so I thought. I convinced myself that if I just worshipped hard enough later, I could avoid the real sacrifice in the now." He closed his eyes for a long moment and took a rattling breath, worn out from the talking. It was a minute before he was able to finish his thought. "You don't gain the gods' favor by taking the easy way out. They make exceptions for no one, man or monster. Remember that." So you just ignored your questings? Darcon asked. Mina shot him a withering look, but behind the scolding, she too had a burning curiosity. Oh, I accepted it, Elder Sloke replied with a laugh. Eventually, once I realized what a spoiled fool I'd been, but it was too late. I missed the chance mapped in my stars, and in doing so, I lost my ability to ever ascend. Darcon swallowed the sudden lump in his throat, his mind drifting to his own constellation scroll, collecting dust in the corner of his chambers. Every initiate had one made specially for them upon joining the order, using the precise positions of the stars on their first night at the temple. No two were alike, and hidden in those intricate diagrams were instructions for quests as diverse and individual as the initiates who undertook them. The master disciples claimed that those directives above all else were the key to ascension. Sloke struggled to sit up, and Mina reached over to help him. He was breathing heavily by the time he was upright, but his fingers dug into her arm when he grabbed it, making her jump. Don't do what I did, he implored, turning from one initiate to the other. If I had done my duty and followed my instructions to the letter, instead of seeking temporary worldly pleasures, comfort, respect, I might be up in the stars at this very moment. I wouldn't be rotting away in this bed. Mina blinked, stunned into silence, and Darcon frowned, weighed down by his own thoughts of death. He wasn't sure how to respond, guilt and frustration sparring in his mind on equal footing. For a moment, he was struck by the image of the stone slab from the tournament, solid and sturdy, streaked with blood and pieces of his own skin. I followed my instructions, didn't I? He wanted to demand, but look where that got me. Mina ducked her head, her expression turbulent. I won't let you down, she told the elder. Not if I can help it. I can't. Her words caught in her throat, and she started again. I can't afford to lose my place here. Darcon's heart went out to her. For all his other failings, he never had to worry about something so out of his control as his physical size. Monastery life was strenuous, and stronger people than Mina had failed to survive its trials. They're not going to kick you out, Min, Darcon told her, reaching out instinctively to touch her hand. It wasn't until he felt Sloke's observant gaze on him that he pulled away. You trounced me in sparring the other day. You found a way to use your size to your advantage. That's worth more than brute strength any day, and I'm sure the master disciples all agree. Mina's eyes met his, and he saw a glimmer of gratitude there, even though it was obvious she didn't believe it. Deep down, he wasn't sure if he believed it either. Your friend has a point, Mina, Elder Sloke agreed. We're always the hardest on ourselves. And why shouldn't we be? Mina replied, looking up. Some comfort, self-pity will be if the master disciples decide I'm not worth training anymore. I'm not sure if I even... She stopped abruptly, looking away. Darcon felt the urge to ask what was on her mind, but he held back. Sloke spoke up instead. Your connection to the goddess always comes first, he told her. You saw that at the tourney when you broke your stone. Have faith in Celestriona. She'll guide you through your doubts. Don't let your mind be clouded by other worries. Mina nodded, resolute. Whatever she asks of me, I'll do it, she replied. Darcon didn't doubt it. Obeying orders was as much Mina's nature as resisting them was in his. The old man let go of her arm. I know it, he acknowledged. I have no doubt you'll eventually become a dragon. You're a good student. You follow the rules and not just the ones that suit you. A sly grin appeared on his face as his eyes slid over to Darcon. Not like this Spitfire here. It's a wonder he hasn't gotten himself into some serious trouble by now. He's not that bad, Mina protested. Darcon cleared his throat. He's sitting right here. A burst of color erupted in Mina's dark cheeks, and she glanced quickly away, her composure rattled. Darcon laughed, giving her a playful nudge. I'm kidding, Min. Sloke smiled, that knowing twinkle back in his eyes. My point still stands, Darcon. You remind me too much of myself at your age. Of course, I wasn't as good-looking. I grew into my beauty later. He guffawed at that, and this time Darcon joined in, the tension broken. Even Mina couldn't keep a straight face. When I first arrived here, I thought you were a ghost, she said. Your skin is so pale that you can practically see through it. She glanced down at her own dark brown skin, so different from the elders. Sloke's former glacial walk tribesmen were an enigma to most, as white and cold as the snowy tundra they called home. Not pale blue like their tundra elf neighbors, but sometimes, in the right light, almost as icy. No one can blame me for thinking that he was, Darcon assured her. Indeed, Elder Sloke agreed through his laughter. I don't suppose you see many of us ice hounds down in the civil lands, do you? I think you would all melt before you got halfway across the border, Mina teased. Brave words from a girl who melts every time Darcon gets too close. The three of them turned in the direction of a new voice, and Darcon immediately scowled. Standing in the doorway was Tidar, one of the other initiates. He and Warred had been cronies ever since their arrival, a couple of asses, the both of them, but their skills couldn't be debated. Darcon had lost count of the times he had butted heads with the pair, and the bad blood between them had only soured further over the years. Mina stared at the newcomer, her discomfort obvious. Tidar's eyes had an especially cruel look about them as they drifted lazily from her to Darcon. What's this? He asked. Are the two of you really too good to spend your leisure time with the rest of us? With you, Tidar? Definitely too good, Darcon replied, springing out of his seat so quickly that Mina had to step back in order to avoid an elbow to the face. From his bed, Sloke observed them with a vague interest. That's hilarious, coming from someone who couldn't manage a simple stone-breaking spell. You're on thin ice, Tidar, Darcon spat, his temper boiling. What the hells do you want? Or did you just come here to gloat? I've been sent to fetch you, dung for brains, Tidar replied. Master Disciple Adriana wants to speak to you. Perhaps I should go too, Mina suggested, glancing reluctantly back at the bedridden Sloke. I was hoping to put in a request for time at the telescope, but if you still need to eat... Tidar glanced at Mina disdainfully. Stick to the infirmary, lambkin, he snapped. It suits you better. Sloke ignored the byplay. Don't mind me. You go see Adriana, he said with a nod to Mina. I think I can manage my affairs for a while. You two have done plenty already. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Tidar's face. Elder Sloke, that's really not necessary, he said. I don't want to disturb your meal. That's quite all right, Sloke replied. I've had my fill of porridge for today. Are you sure? Mina asked. Positive, Elder Sloke responded. Besides, I'm not about to be the one to keep Adriana waiting. I'll stay put. It's not like I can go anywhere. He reclined back into his cushions before shooting a knowing glance at Darcon. Perhaps I'll even doze off, getting a beauty nap of my own. Tidar pursed his lips, but even he was loath to argue with an elder. Fine then, he said, crossing his arms and jerking his head towards the door. Let's go. Moss is starting to grow on me. Darcon repaid the old man's wit with his signature crooked grin, got up, and trailed after Tidar, who was already heading into the hallway. Mina glanced once more at Sloke, who gave her a nod of approval. Thank you, Elder, she murmured, bowing to him, before she exited the infirmary. Darcon, walking backwards out of the door, gave his own hasty half-bow and fell into step beside her. The hallway ran the length of the infirmary wing, occasionally forking and branching off into other rooms. The Master Disciples' quarters, the cold storage, the kitchens, and the supply closets. The air was still and cool, and the only sound was their bare feet glancing off the tile floor. The other students would all be out milling about the temple grounds right now, taking advantage of what little free time they were allotted between all the sparring, studying, and praying. Did Master Disciple Adriana say what she wanted? Darcon asked, already dreading the answer. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. He was only ever summoned by the Master Disciples when he was in trouble, a common enough occurrence by his own admission. No, Tidar replied with his practiced sneer. She didn't tell me anything. Is she in the tower? The other boy shook his head. Her office, he replied, not looking at Darcon. This way. He didn't offer anything more, and Darcon didn't ask. Instead, he turned his attention to Mina, who glanced up at him as they approached the exit, having to crane her neck. So, how was it sweeping the steps yesterday? She teased. Did you get them all done? Wore the broom down to a nub, Darcon joked back. A familiar voice spoke up as they rounded the corner. What's this about getting your nub worn out? The pair stopped dead in their tracks. and Darcon grit his teeth. Warred was leaning against the wall by the door. He shot Tidar a look. She wasn't supposed to come. Tidar shrugged. Had to bring her. Slook sent her away. Her loss. Warwood's smirk grew as he straightened up, and it took everything Darcon had not to slap it from his face. I've always wondered, Mina, Tidar asked, crossing his arms. Do you shave your beard, or do you have to use wax? Not a dwarf, Mina replied coolly, turning away from the door. Perhaps she hoped Darcon would follow, but he remained where he was, clenching his teeth. The only thing he detested more than his fellow initiates' jabs was when they were directed at Mina. Wouldn't be able to tell, Warwood said, his shadow falling across their path as he stepped in front of the doorway. Rain had begun to fall outside, tapping a rhythmic pattern on the roof. Master-disciple Sonia is from the Civil Lands too, and she's as tall as your boyfriend here. He jerked his chin in Darcon's direction. Knock it off, Darcon growled. Ignore him, Mina said, returning to his side and giving his arm a tug. They're just upset that when their hair finally came in, it was on their asses and not around on their fronts. Brave talk, runt, Tidar interjected, moving to stand beside his crony. Come on, Darcon, she continued to pull at her friend's elbow. If we leave, they'll lose interest. Maybe, Warwood said, holding up a hand. He grinned, taking a step closer to Mina. But do you think you'll be able to outrun us on those tiny twig legs? That's it. Darcon shook off Mina's hand and strode up to the pair, rage surging into his fists. He didn't know what he was going to do, but it didn't matter. The sight of Warwood spitting teeth onto the stone floor was all he really cared about right now. You'll both be looking up to her when I break your knees. Warwood stepped forward, unafraid. Tough talk for a kid with busted. He didn't finish his sentence before the chaos broke out. Darcon threw the first punch, but within seconds, the three boys were lost in a flurry of kicks and strikes. Out of the corner of his eye, Darcon saw Mina standing frozen in place, her fists clenched at her sides, although the desire to leap in was written on her face. She didn't engage. Elder Sloke's earlier words to her, "You follow the rules, and not just the ones that suit you," rang in his mind for the briefest of moments, but then he was taking a punch to the kidneys, and all rational thought went out of him. The fight escalated, moving from punches and kicks to knees and elbows, and Darcon had just enough sense to worry about what might happen if the others decided to start calling on Celestriona. It might have gotten to that point if they hadn't been interrupted. A shrill female voice rang out through the corridor. "All of you, stop that this instant!" Mistress Geraldine stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping down her leathery face, her eyes gleaming with anger. How could someone so plump and grandmotherly exude such a frightening air? Not for the first time, Darcon wondered just how the woman had ended up as a healer, of all things. Warwood sprang away from him, blanching. "Mistress Geraldine," he said through a mouthful of blood, "we thought you were eating." "I was," the older woman snapped, "until I heard you three scuffling and squawking like a bunch of roosters. Fighting on monastery grounds," she spat. "Despicable." "It wasn't our fault," Tidar protested, as he struggled to his feet, nursing a broken nose with one hand as he pointed at Darcon with the other. "He started it." Mistress Geraldine sniffed. "Indeed?" Darcon straightened up, glowering. His left eye was already throbbing and swelling shut. It would no doubt be purple by the end of the day. "Mina and I just wanted to get to the observatory," he explained. "These two were trying to start trouble." Mistress Geraldine crossed her arms, unimpressed. "You don't need to tell me what happened, Darcon. I saw the whole thing. You know the rules about fights. Whoever strikes the first blow serves the punishment." "But that's not," Darcon began. Ignoring him, the healer leveled an intimidating stare Mina's way. "You should be glad you didn't join in, Mina, or you'd be on my list now, too. As for you two," she glared at Tidar and Warwood, "assuming nothing is broken, get out of my sight." Warwood didn't need to be told twice, slinking off into one of the connecting hallways. Tidar remained. "What about my nose?" he demanded. "The infirmary," Mistress Geraldine snapped, glaring at the gangly boy as he scurried off in the direction of the sick room where Elder Sloke was convalescing. "Darcon," she continued, rounding on him, "I want you out in the courtyard with Nagus. You've just lost the rest of your free time." Darcon glanced from her to Mina, ready to argue, but there was no sense in it. The damage was done. "Yes, Mistress Geraldine," he replied, sighing. Stealing a wary glance in the healer's direction, he started for the observatory, aware of Mina watching him from the doorway. As he reached the middle of the courtyard, Darcon paused, turned around, and gave her a smile and a knowing shrug. Chapter 3. Seth. Beyond the verdant canopy above Seth Darkstar's head, darkness consumed the sky. Sunset had come and gone, and although the moons were on the rise, they were hidden from view, obscured by a blanket of evergreen needles so thick that it blocked out all light. The springtime brisk air was clear, and it carried the scent of recent rain, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the forest. The trees muffled the sounds around him, dampening the noises of the valley in the distance, and adding to the sense of isolation that already hung over the foothills. Their branches whispered a haunting melody as they scraped against one another, and even the drumbeat of his footsteps on the rain-soaked path was dulled, as if he had entered a place where life itself was muted. The night stretched out around him, and on some level, Seth felt sure that it would swallow him if he let it. This deep into the wilds, it was easy to become disoriented. He was on the verge of consulting his map when a solitary staircase hewn into the mountainside appeared in the darkness before him, just past a sharp bend in the path. Moss clung to its stone steps, which were narrow enough to have him watching his footing as he began to climb. The first 30 steps took him past the tree line, where the hard-panned soil quickly became talus, the sumptuous forest dropping away to reveal bleak upper slopes. Before him, the summit of Mount Basridon drove into the air like a twisted tooth. Something about the sight of that cold, ragged, barren peak made Seth, lone traveler that he was, feel all the lonelier. At 50 steps, the staircase began to wind, and his view of the sky opened into more blackness. But at last he could see the first moons of the evening. They hung low above the horizon, no more than slivers, but fresh charcoal-gray clouds were swiftly moving in, threatening to hide them from view once more. At 200 steps, an ominous anvil of dark gray had settled overhead, rolling and roiling with the promise of rain, and, if the gods were so inclined, lightning. Seth stopped dead in his tracks for a moment, staring up at those clouds for longer than he cared to admit. There was something entrancing about them, entrancing and frightening. Grunting, Seth climbed another step and then another. The steadily increasing elevation sent the temperature plunging, but despite the growing shadows and chill wind that now whipped at his hair and cloak, he was feverish. The stairs had become steeper, and he would have to pick up the pace if he was to have any hope of arriving before the rain did. 350. Seth tallied, careful not to lose his footing. He was one misstep away from a plunge that would end with his broken body lying at the base of the mountain. The steps could hardly be considered steps at all at this point. Instead, they were more a series of ragged ledges. Some were mere inches, while others were tall enough to make even a long-legged traveler stretch and grunt with effort to reach the next one. Overgrown with lichen, they had been worn dangerously smooth by time, and footsteps too innumerable for him to count. The thought that the celestial worshippers braved this hike every time they left the monastery was almost inconceivable, especially now that he was experiencing it firsthand. Hells, I'm not built for this. Seth gritted his teeth as the treacherous mountain pathway wore on him. Despite being more mage than warrior, he was built like a foot soldier, not a mountaineer, with a paunch that wasn't getting any smaller as the years started to tally up. Idly, he wondered just how thick his belly would become once he was no longer shielded by youth. Not that his 24 years felt young, they'd been hard years, for certain. No matter. He had come all this way, and he wasn't about to leave empty-handed. They wouldn't let him. 376, he thought, setting his jaw and continuing to lever himself upward. Pain coursed through him, but it didn't originate in any strained muscle or old wound. It was coming from his skin itself, more precisely, from the series of ruined tattoos that ran from his neck to his ankles. Their call was as painful as it was irresistible, their beguiling whispers seeming to come from both within and without, racing through his ruined body and manipulating him like a puppet on a string. Sometimes he understood the things they asked of him. More often he did not, but he never failed to follow them where they led him, and he had learned over the years not to question their voice. As abhorrent as it was all he had. 379. The burning grew worse, a constant reminder of what was at stake. It drove him upward like a taskmaster, but Seth Darkstar was no stranger to being pushed far past his physical limits. His life was not his own, and never had been. This had better be worth it, he thought, sucking in another gulp of thin mountain air. At the very least, he had earned himself a roast duck when he got back to the nearest tavern. The whole plucked bird, in fact. That was, of course, assuming he ever made it back down the mountainside. Through sheer force of will, he marched ever onward. As he did, images crossed his mind, images he would have preferred to forget. Fire was one of them. Lightning was another. There were faces, too, their features made grotesque by red light, and a scream that perpetually threatened to well up in his chest, matching the sharp crescendo of his mutilated skin. He couldn't tell which ones were dreams, the confused musings of a preoccupied mind, and which ones were memories. Perhaps it was better not to know. His discomfort only increased as he climbed higher. What had started as a faint prickling in his flesh, like the feeling of blood rushing back to a limb that had fallen asleep, had become a deeply itching irritation. It was as if he had fallen into a pile of dry autumn leaves, and he had to resist the urge to scratch madly at his skin. This was no ordinary mountain. Magic pervaded the upper slopes, centered around the temple of Celestriona, and his skin was raw and sensitive under its assault. His tattoos drew on his magic as they did with all forms of energy, pulling it into his body until he was heavy with it, saturated like a sponge soaked with fiery oil, and desperate to discharge it. But he wouldn't be able to, not until he was back in the lowlands. It didn't help that he was already straining to maintain a spell of his own, a shadowy enchantment used to alter his appearance, manifesting the illusion of a faint beard around his chin and changing his eye color from pond blue to acorn brown. That was no abomination, not like his skin, and it was a simple enough spell for any practiced mage to master. But most mages weren't living lightning rods. Seth glanced once more at the rain clouds again and shuddered. As he was on the verge of the 440th step, the incline finally leveled out, and the stone stairs gave way to a cobblestone path that snaked out across the leveled-off mountaintop. There, poking out against the gray sky, was a bronze dome, glimmering even in the low light of the coming storm. Seth exhaled, a relieved breath, indulging in a momentary rest. His markings wouldn't leave him alone for long, but he could justify a quick break while he squinted in the direction of the tower. There was no mistaking it. The Temple of Celestriona. It rose up from the top of the mountain like the last stop between the world and the sky, a monument to the heavens that drew devotees and adventurers alike to these barren slopes. It made sense that the Order would set up shop here, all in pursuit of their ever-elusive divinity. It allowed them to track the flying paths of the celestial dragons they so revered. The path wound tightly between the boulders that had once smoothed the mountaintop flat, strewn about from centuries past. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, his stomach plunging. Relax, he told himself. Count? So he did. With no more stairs left, he settled on tallying his footsteps, keeping track of them from the first bend in the path all the way to the temple grounds, which were barricaded to the outside world by a high stone wall. That was understandable. Roving bands of raiders and mercenaries roamed the Azola Valley below, no doubt occasionally venturing into the foothills. This was the frontier, and it wasn't safe even at the best of times. A steel portcullis opened onto the foreyard, flanked on either side by a pair of sinewy senior disciples. They were dressed in a lightweight uniform typical of the Order, consisting of loosely wrapped trousers woven from strong fabric and emblazoned with images of the constellations. The male initiate, like most men of the temple, wore no shirt, while his female companion had opted for a lightweight tunic. Their calloused hands were protected by tight linen wraps, but their feet were bare. There was no doubt as to why the guards immediately bristled as he approached. Despite its fame, the Order of Celestriona was notoriously leery of outside interlopers. Though they were unarmed, Seth knew better than to assume they were no challenge. Besides, he reminded himself, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Or, as his mother would have said, you catch more mages with spellbooks than blades. With that in mind, Seth plastered a jovial smile onto his face and raised a hand to the guards. Welcome to the Temple of Celestriona, the male guard spoke in an obviously formal, yet not entirely unfriendly tone. May the stars guide your steps. May the goddess shade you from harsh sunlight. What brings you up our rocky slopes? His companion asked. I have a message for one of your initiates, Seth replied, reaching into his satchel. Darcon of Breakmore? I was told I could find him here. He produced a scroll with Darcon's name printed on the outside of the curled parchment in neat lettering. The woman hesitated, looking the stranger over for an uncomfortable minute before glancing to her companion. They exchanged a look. Finally, she turned back to Seth and gave him a stiff nod. Darcon is in the courtyard, she informed him. I believe he's on punishment duty. The male guard made a noise that might have been a snicker. His partner shot him a quealing look. Trying to ignore the byplay, Seth made a move toward the gate, but the woman's hand flew out and seized his wrist. Her hand wraps protected her, but Seth instinctively pulled back, always wary of anyone making contact with his skin. One handshake was enough to drop a grown man. The last thing he needed right now was the slew of undue questions that inevitably followed the discovery of his strange and terrible curse. It wasn't like he had chosen any of this. If the guard noticed his caginess, it did not show on her face. Apologies, she said, her tongue brusque. But you will need permission from Darcon's mentor to go inside. Relieved, Seth nodded his understanding and stepped back, watching as the male guard retreated through the open gate. Seth chewed the inside of his lip. If Darcon's instructor came to pick up the message on his behalf, then it was all over. All the thaumaturge could do now was wait, pray, and try not to fidget. It was a struggle. This close to the temple, the air practically buzzed with divine energy, waves of power that battered him from all angles. The slightest breeze might as well have been a razor on his skin, the smallest movement of his muscles a hammer to his bruised body. The remaining guard was quiet as they waited for her companion to return, the wind filling the silence as it raced across the barren mountaintop. A few minutes later, the second guard returned, coming to a stop 9 paces away from the entrance, and motioning for the thaumaturge to follow him, not eager to remain in this place a minute longer than he had to. Seth bit back his discomfort and stepped into the rippling power of the monastery grounds. The temple was just as Darcon's brother had described it, unlike anything Seth had ever seen before. The Spartan designs of the low brick buildings were enlivened by tiered spires and intricate tile roofs. It was clear that the architects had reserved the real ostentatiousness for the main tower, however. Massive and unbelievably ornate, it was as much a monument to the monastery's power as it was to the sky itself, where the goddess and her celestial dragons dwelled in darkness. The buildings had been erected on a secondary mound of earth, concealed from the outside by the towering outer wall. A curving series of steps led them gently up the slope, and as they broke over the top of the plateau, they were greeted with a stunning view. Endless ragged peaks before them, and the Azula Valley behind them. It sprawled far below, all lush hills, barely visible under the storm-darkened sky. In the distance, Seth could make out faint trails of smoke and the twinkling lights of some unnamed town. A nearby mill butted up against a slow-moving river, the water wheel churning in slow, steady circles. Not a bad tactical decision, he decided, quartering all the way up here. They would see an attack coming from miles away, and the only feasible route up the mountain was via the treacherous stairway. This way, his escort said, beckoning the still-winded Seth in the direction of the training yard. Master-disciple Nagus would not appreciate the interruption. This shouldn't take more than a moment, Seth replied. I just need to deliver this letter. Like my fellow guard Slipwell said, Darcon is currently being reprimanded for fighting on temple grounds, the disciple responded. Whether he is allowed to have a letter given to him will be left to Nagus's discretion. He may decide to withhold it. I hope not, Seth replied in a level voice, his eyes fixed forward as they made their way through the courtyard. I only get paid for putting it directly in Darcon's hands. The shadow magic altering his appearance strained under the power emanating from the observatory, and the effort required to maintain his disguise grew with every step closer to the courtyard. The energy was pouring into his skin in a deluge, like rolling water rushing over the top of a dam. The practice yard was located to the east, and even from a distance, Seth could make out the solitary form of a young trainee being put through a strenuous set of exercises by a man in his mid to late 30s. Darcon himself, though obviously at least a decade younger than his master, stood nearly as tall, and Nagus was the tallest of all the masters. A comparison to his twin brother, Bregon, was at once inevitable. Their lives had obviously gone in 2 completely different directions. The initiate's movements were precise and confident as he performed his drills, working through the forms with an ease that could have only come from years of dedicated practice. The senior instructor circled around the boy, making subtle adjustments to his position and murmuring corrections in a low, measured voice. Despite the intense activity, a stoic air suffused the grounds, a kind of energy that could only be found where the magical connection was strongest. Up here, it was terribly and painfully strong. There wasn't an inch of Seth that did not buzz with pain. It's the Order, Seth realized, swaying a little on his feet. This is their doing. Dedicated divine communion over the course of hundreds of years had turned this place into a beacon, a great fountain of divine magic so strong that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. You knew this was likely to happen, he reminded himself, scrutinizing his surroundings. Elsewhere on the grounds, other members of the Order carried on with their evening. 4 instructing priests and 11 initiates, 3 female, 8 male. They were all either moving about standing to watch Darcon sweat through his drills, or otherwise fulfilling their duties elsewhere amongst the various buildings. Seth counted a total of 22 windows, each segmented into quarters by small panes, which brought the number of squares to 88. He and the guard had taken 78 strides from the main entrance, not including the 23 steps from the lower level to the plateau where the courtyard stood. There wasn't much left to count. Still, desperate for a distraction, Seth resorted to asking his escort, "So, it's true that you train at night here?" Most people below would be preparing to settle in for the night right now, but the students in the training yard showed no signs of slowing down. Seth had already taken great pains to learn the Order's schedule, but it helped to maintain an appearance of ignorance. As far as the worshippers here knew, he was nothing but a passerby. Besides, his skin was crawling and crackling, and it was either run his mouth or start hopping from foot to foot. The man turned a guarded look on him, as if in a concerted effort to not be rude in his assessment of Seth's intellect. "When the night sky is the cornerstone of your worship, your day begins just before sunset," he replied. "That makes sense," the thaumaturge conceded. Not even the most powerful magic in the world could make the stars come out before night had fallen. The disciples' quest for rebirth was a worthy goal, to be sure, but Seth couldn't imagine living his life by the movements of the planets. Then again, I'm not so different. His life's course was already written, dictated to him by this ink set into his skin. Maybe he could imagine following the skies after all. Anything would be better than the duty that had been foisted upon him, buried in his flesh in the most literal sense. Will the temple do anything special for tomorrow's spring equinox? It was all he could do, not to start scratching madly at his skin. No, the guard replied without elaboration. Instead, he glanced up at the overcast sky. Weather seemed imminent. The whipping wind carried the telltale smell of rain, and exposed high on the mountain like this, one could almost feel the pressure changing, static filling the air in an ominous warning. Lightning, Seth thought, now biting his lip hard enough that he tasted blood. He supposed a storm was to his advantage, though, especially if his errand took longer than he was anticipating. With any luck, the obfuscating clouds would keep the initiates out of the observatory tower. The only matter left was to find a way inside. At last, they came to a stop within striking distance of the training yard. "Wait here," the guard instructed, leaving the younger man behind without another word. Seth watched as he picked his way across the courtyard to approach the practicing pair, and after a few moments of muffled discussion, Darcon's instructor nodded and guided his initiate back toward him. Seth stayed rooted to the spot, observing the newcomers with veiled interest. The boy trudged along behind his teacher, squinting at Seth out of one good eye. The other was purple with bruises, nearly swollen shut. A badge of honor or an embarrassment? He guessed the latter. He doubted a black eye said anything good in a culture as fixated on dignity as the Order of Celestriona. Up close, Darcon looked even less like the twin Seth had met up with in Verdalam. While Brygon's eyes were brown, the color of roughly hewn tree bark, Darcon's were the muddy gray of rusted iron. They hadn't lost the fire of youth, and there was a brashness in the way they gleamed. Brygon had been broad of shoulder and heavily muscled from years of hard living in the forest among the augurs of the old ways. Darcon, on the other hand, displayed a balance of body and form that Seth wouldn't have expected from a 16-year-old. Even at 24 himself, the thaumaturge doubted he would ever match the characteristic poise with which all Order disciples seemed to carry themselves. "I am Master Disciple Nagus," Darcon's mentor introduced himself, greeting Seth with a shallow bow. I was told you came with a message for my pupil. I hope you aren't too exhausted. The climb up can be taxing." Seth picked apart the man's words, looking for any obvious sarcasm, and was surprised to realize the man seemed to be showing concern. Pushing away his preconceptions, the thaumaturge gave the man a smile and replied, "Not a bit, though I nearly wore the leather off my pants during that climb. I couldn't get my knees to stop rubbing together." Nagas chuckled. "That's a lesson we all learn the hard way, I'm afraid. Cotton trousers will save you a good deal of discomfort on your next trip here." Seth didn't bother to tell him that he had no plans of returning to this place ever again. Instead, he inclined his head respectfully. "I appreciate you allowing me to interrupt your training." "It's no trouble at all," Nagas replied. "I don't mind an interruption on a cloudy night like this, although, I have to admit, I'm a little surprised to see a messenger all the way up here." He crossed his arms, and Seth's blood ran cold. But only for a moment. Surely it would be less expensive to just send a babble bird. It would, Seth acknowledged, his heart beating a little more rapidly than usual, but babble birds are hard to find of late, even for the augurs. Indeed, the master disciple raised his eyebrows, sizing Seth up for another moment, and then shrugged. "That's unfortunate. Well, I admire your dedication. At any rate, this is my student, Initiate Darcon of Breakmore." Darcon gave Seth a thin smile, but it was the surly look of a teenager who would rather be anywhere else but here. "Nice to meet you." Seth was already reaching into his bag. "I have a message for you." Once again, he withdrew the crinkled scroll he had shown the guards upon entering, but he did not hand it over just yet. Darcon raised his eyebrows. "Who from?" "Your brother, Bragon." Seth turned the parchment towards the boy so he could read the name scrawled on it. "He must really like you to pay the kind of money he did to have this delivered. I wouldn't give any of my brothers the time of day, let alone spend money to do it." It sometimes surprised even him how easily deception came when he wanted it to. He had no siblings, but the words rolled off his tongue as easily as if he had grown up with a dozen of them. And just like that, Darcon took the bait. Seeing Bragon's name drew the stiffness right out of him, surety giving way to eagerness. Even his swollen eye seemed to sparkle. "You're kidding," he said, disbelieving. "How is he? Is he safe?" He nodded down at the letter. "Any idea if he sent word about Mother or Chansey? I doubt she would have talked to him, but he is pretty close to where she's stationed." The words tumbled out of him, carrying an air of boyish enthusiasm that a part of Seth envied. "I imagine he put the answer to all those questions in his letter," Seth replied indulgently as Darcon reached for the scroll. "Hold for a second, Darcon," Master Disciple Nagas said, gently but firmly grabbing his pupil's wrist and arresting his move for the letter. "You are currently working off a punishment right now. I don't think a reward is in order." Darcon stiffened as if he had been punched in the back. His brow furrowed, anger flashing across his youthful face, and for a moment he looked as if he would snatch his arm away from his superior. In the end, however, his training and desire to read his brother's message won over. It was clearly a battle for him, and the furrow between his brows deepened even as he physically relaxed. "He's frustrated." "Good. I can work with that." "Yes, Master Disciple," Darcon grunted. "Perhaps I could do something to earn the right to read it, if that's what you're getting at." Nothing comes immediately to mind. Nagas let go of Darcon's wrist, and the young boy's arms dropped stiffly to his sides. Seth could not have been given a better opening. "You know," he mused, turning to Darcon's mentor, "I've never seen a monastery up close before, Master Nagas." "It is quite spectacular," the disciple agreed, giving him a sagely smile. He wasn't taking the hint, and the seconds were melting away. Seth's fingers twitched, his skin protesting. The sooner he could get this done, the sooner he would have some relief from the haughty power of this place. Although, somewhere deep down, in a place not even his markings could reach, Seth knew there was no relief to be found. Not now, and perhaps not ever. A bit more of a nudge was in order. "It's almost a shame to leave so soon after coming all the way up here," he went on, flashing Nagas what he hoped was a disarming smile. "I wonder if it would be possible to arrange a tour. If I might be so bold, perhaps, that would be a satisfactory discipline for young Darcon here." He pointed the rolled-up scroll at the boy, but still did not hand it over. "I've always had a bit of a fascination with your people's cosmic research. Master Disciple Nagus thought for a moment, his eyes on Seth's, and for a split second, Seth wondered if he had overplayed his hand. Then, at last, the older man smiled. Very well, he responded. You may give Darcon the scroll once he has shown you around. Some areas are off limits, of course, but I trust that won't be an issue. He nodded to his student, not taking his eyes off Seth. It's not every day that travelers take an interest in our studies. Darcon, if you would be so kind as to show... I'm sorry. What was your name again? Leth, Seth replied mechanically, of Port Haven. Nagus turned to Darcon. If you would be so kind as to show Leth the temple grounds before he goes on his way, it's only polite given how far he's come. Once you've seen him out, you may read your letter. Be sure you stay with our guest at all times. He returned his attention to Seth. I hope you understand. Our tenants instruct us to be gracious, but caution is still warranted when it comes to outsiders. You know how things are these days. What went unsaid was just how far the Order would go to protect its secrets, especially from those with unsavory intentions. What also went unsaid was what might happen if those secrets were to be exposed. Seth smiled stiffly and nodded, scratching at his shadow beard. The magical assault was coming from all sides now, enough to make his muscles spasm and his heart jump and jolt in his chest like a cricket in a box. He hoped he would be able to keep the disguise going amidst the cacophony. You're almost there, Seth reminded himself. All that was left now was to get rid of Darcon and steal away with the boy's constellation scroll. And the Order's sacred armillary box. Chapter 4. Darcon. Once I'm done with Leth, will I be allowed the rest of my break? Darcon could only hope the eagerness wasn't obvious in his voice, but it was nearly impossible to hide. The last thing he wanted to do was give a tour to some overly interested stranger, especially when word from his brother was at his fingertips. It had been half a year since he had last heard from Brigon, and even longer since he had heard any word from Chansey or their mother. Their family's travels had sent each of them to far-flung places, and although the promise of honor and adventure had faded long ago, the distance between them remained as great and insurmountable as ever. Darcon often found himself wondering whether that distance would ever be closed again. His mentor looked up at the sky, as if seeking a response to Darcon's question among the clouds. After your nightly training and chores are finished, Master Disciple Nagus replied in a measured tone, and those will have to wait until after you finish the tour of Leth. So much for that, then. Darcon steamed, searching his mentor's face for something, mirth, he supposed. Gods knew he would be enjoying himself on a power trip like the one Nagus was pulling here. Was he really going to make him wait like this? All for scuffling with those bastards Tidar and Warrid? Sure, he had thrown the first punch, but it had been Warrid who had been lying in wait, ready to spring on what he thought was going to be a single student. Clearly, the only thing that had stopped him from jumping Darcon immediately had been Mina's presence. There was no knowing what they would have tried if she hadn't been there to witness what happened. Haven't I done enough punishment already? He protested, sparing a weary glance at the bearded courier, who was looking decidedly uncomfortable. He can guide himself. I need to know what Brigon says. What if it's important? What if... He trailed off, unable to finish. All the time away from home had filled his mind with unpleasant possibilities. Consider this a lesson in patience, then, Nagus replied coolly. Something that, after your little altercation today, I think we can all agree you're in desperate need of. His eyes narrowed. Now, I trust you will represent our order with dignity, poise, and a cool head. Pressing his lips together, Darcon looked from Nagus to Leth, still holding his prize. Fine, he muttered. His instructor hadn't said anything about speed. He would keep the visit quick as he could get away with anyway. I'll show him around. Master Disciple Nagus nodded his approval. Very good. Leth was shifting his weight ever so slightly from foot to foot. His brows furrowed in thought. When he noticed Darcon looking at him, he smiled. We can take our time. Darcon struggled not to groan. Was the whole damned temple conspiring against him? I'm not looking forward to tackling those stairs again. Even going down, the broad-shouldered man continued, hesitating for another moment before holding the scroll out to Darcon. Here, why don't you hold on to this while you show me around? He rubbed his hands over the slight paunch of his stomach. All right, Darcon replied. Let's go, then. Make sure to take him by the kitchens as well, Master Disciple Nagus called as they retreated. I'm sure the man wouldn't mind a meal for himself, and maybe another to take with him on the journey back. With that, his mentor drew away, off to give grief to some other unsuspecting initiate, no doubt, maybe even Warrid. Oh, Darcon hoped it would be Warrid. Lead the way, Leth said, and something in his body language told Darcon he was as eager to get the tour underway as Darcon was to have the blasted thing over with. Either that, or he had to take a piss. It was hard to tell. Darcon turned in the direction of the long, narrow building close to the entrance, pausing to glance back at Leth. First is the infirmary, I guess, he offered as they turned in that direction. But now that I think about it, Elder Sluk is resting there now. We shouldn't disturb him. Let's go to the wrestling ring instead. Abruptly, he changed direction and led Leth through the courtyard, pointing out the series of scattered training venues in rapid succession. He recited as much information as he thought would appease the Corps' curiosity before moving them quickly to the next area of interest, all the while stealing continuous glances back in the direction of the initiate's quarters. But he was putting in an effort, and that had to count for something. The dormitories are just over here, Darcon went on, gesturing at the simple, squat building facing the valley below. Leth's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly, throwing Darcon off for a split second. Wasn't he the one who wanted this damn tour? We do all our combat training outside, even in the rain, he continued, after a moment. Fair weather fighting never builds discipline. That's what the masters always say. Not sure I believe them yet. Darcon looked up at the overcast sky, just as his mentor had done minutes earlier. What he sought there, not even he could say. Patience, like Nagus had said. Skill? That ever-elusive connection to Celestriona, who seemed to have turned her back on him? The melancholy passed. Coming back to himself, Darcon shrugged and pointed out another duo of buildings. That's the prayer room, there, and on the second floor is the meditation chamber. Next to it is one of the storage sheds, and then there's the kitchens, the library, the master's studies. Leth nodded along, his eyes sweeping over the grounds, taking in every detail. There was something analytical about the way he looked around, like he was a student studying for an exam and not a visitor touring an exotic place. Not that that was any of Darcon's business. His eye was beginning to ache again, as was his impatience. Nagus had mentioned food, but Darcon neglected to bring his visitor inside when the two of them passed the kitchens. There would be time for that after he'd read his brother's message, and besides, one look at the Corps' belly told him he wasn't exactly starving. Leth, for his part, was looking increasingly uneasy the closer they drew to the observatory. When they finally came to a stop outside the tower, there were little beads of sweat forming at his temples. "Are you all right?" Darcon asked, daring to hope he would decide he'd had enough sightseeing. Leth turned to him, eyebrows raised, and wiped at his forehead. "I think it's the altitude," he replied. "I don't usually deliver to mountain tops." "Fair enough," Darcon replied, taking another glance at Rhaegon's scroll, still unopened in his hand. "Would you like me to escort you to the stairs?" "And miss out on the crown jewel of the monastery?" Leth laughed. "Hardly." Disappointing, but not surprising. The temple observatory was considered an architectural and spiritual wonder all throughout Dragondrizzle. Few were given the opportunity to see it in person, and it made for quite the story down at the local tavern, even if the closest local tavern was nearly 2 days away. "Well," Darcon replied, extending his arms toward the building before them. "Here it is." He craned his neck to get a better look, and Leth followed suit. For all his complaints about living in the Order, the observatory never failed to take Darcon's breath away. Dotted with windows and covered with sigils, from the base to the dome, and imposed strong reality against the vaporous clouds behind it. There was something foreboding about it, almost as if it were alive, a great, unfathomable beast, observing the world below with a bright, omniscient gaze. They stepped up to an enormous door, wrought from wood and tempered steel. Darcon frowned, fiddling with the medallion his sister Chansey had made for him before striding into the tower, Leth trailing behind him. Once inside, he and the visitor took in the sights before them. The interior walls, painted the indigo of a midnight sky, were littered with diagrams of the constellations, alongside glyphs of power and illustrations from the sacred texts. A constellation-like series of lines radiated from star to star, forming the intricately wrought, sweeping figure of a beautiful woman with draconic wings. Celestriona herself. She overlooked dozens of desks, tables, and pedestals, along with hundreds of circular shelves that lined the walls, each crammed with numerous books, maps, and star charts. The only thing that stole attention away from her was the telescope that dominated the tower. Scholars, members of other orders, and astronomers from all across the continent traveled to the mountaintop seeking permission to use it, and it wasn't hard to understand why. It provided unparalleled views of the heavens, bringing even the farthest stars into sharp relief and allowing gazers to track the trails of the many celestial dragons going about their business in the cosmos. The device itself was massive, as if someone had taken an ordinary spyglass and scanned it up to a mind-boggling size. 100-year oak tree would have seemed minuscule beside it. Supporting the device was an intricate network of mechanisms, gears, and pulleys, arranged so that it pointed directly skyward, hundreds of feet above them. A series of gigantic wheels controlled the circular panels that formed the bronze dome, which was opened every clear night for the Order's ritual stargazing. Tonight didn't seem likely. Even though the storm was only threatening, the clouds lingered like a gray blanket. Darcon turned to Leth, expecting a look of awe or admiration, but instead, the man appeared tense. His heavy brows furrowed as he glanced around the room. "It's beautiful," he pronounced after a long moment, his voice reverberating off the high walls. Even Darcon, restless as he was, had to agree. The courier shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. "Must have been all kinds of hell to get it up the mountain. Nebula, the celestial dragon from the skies of Darkreach, flew it up here from Kinroot in the Clanstone Mountains after it was constructed," Darcon replied, reciting the story he'd heard since he had arrived. "That was centuries ago, and not even our oldest elder, Snowthorn, was around then. But I bet it was quite the sight." He said this last bit with the slightest hint of facetiousness, but Leth didn't seem to pick up on it. The courier nodded, backing up a step towards the doorway. "Lots of desks in here," he observed. "Is there one for everybody?" "No. We have to share, which means rotating days when we're allowed in here. You have to get permission ahead of time." Darcon was no stranger to this rule. He'd been yelled at more than once for being in here when he wasn't supposed to. "Anyway, this is where we do most of our research when we're not studying in our rooms." He strode up to the base of the telescope, and although Leth watched him, he didn't follow. "At night, the senior instructors gather us here to show us how to track the movements of the stars. We use the telescope to read our constellation scrolls. Although it's been a while since I've been able to. A while since I've been allowed to, more like." Leth seemed to perk up at that. "Constellation scrolls?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "I think I remember hearing about those in passing once. They're pretty important, aren't they?" "You could say that, yeah," Darcon replied, a little haughtily, stealing a glance at the door. "They're everything." "Does every initiate have one?" "Yes," Darcon replied, biting his lip. "We get them as soon as we arrive at the temple." He returned to fidgeting with his brother's message, his mind everywhere but here. There was no knowing what Bragon was doing, or even where he was, and that assumed some disaster had befallen him or his tribe. "Is that so?" Leth asked, shuffling his feet as he peered inquisitively around the room. Darcon blew out a breath, forced a thin smile, and nodded. This courier was quickly becoming an annoyance. He was sick of explaining things and sick of babysitting. Leth seemed to be in some kind of hurry anyway, probably to get to the kitchens. That would just waste more time, but at least his mouth would be full of gruel instead of questions. Darcon took one final look around before turning back to the door, only for the courier to catch at him again. "Where is yours, if you don't mind me asking?" "My scroll? We keep them in our rooms and bring them out as needed," Darcon replied, glancing out over Leth's shoulder in the direction of the dormitories. "We use the star maps to update them and to track our progress on our quest for ascension." "I would," Leth began, and then cut himself off, shaking his head. "No, never mind, forget it." "What?" Darcon asked impatiently. "I mean, I understand that they're special," Leth replied. "I wouldn't want to intrude, it's just that I've never seen one in real life before. The culture of this place, the power of it. I would be remiss if I didn't at least ask." Sensing an opportunity, Darcon seized on his response. Privacy. True, he hadn't planned on bringing anyone to his chambers, but if it had meant getting a chance to read his brother's message, he was more than willing to change the plan. "I can show it to you, if you want," he offered, stealing another glance at the letter in his hands. "Only if it's not too much trouble," Leth hastened to reply. "I feel like I've taken advantage of your hospitality already." "It's no trouble at all," Darcon responded, already making toward the exit. "Come on, I'll take you there. just across the way. They retreated from the tower, passing by the dining hall as they went. From the open door drifted the raised voices of the other initiates, who were enjoying their meal. Cinnamon porridge, by the smell of it, along with what might have been dwarven bread. "Looks like everybody is getting food," Leth remarked. Darcon nodded, not looking at him. "Yes, we break for 2 hours around midnight for lunch. After that, it's back to studying and running drills until supper. Just before dawn, they'll be serving food for a while yet. Please, for the love of Celestriona, don't let him pull me off to the dining hall now." "So, is it really just food, training, and stargazing up here?" the courier asked. "And meditation," Darcon added, picking up the pace. "Lots and lots of meditation." He frowned, his mood darkening. Leth eyed him, rubbing the back of his neck. "You don't seem too keen on that." "Keen on sitting in silence, you mean? Shutting my eyes and wasting my time waiting for some world-shaking revelation to light up my mind?" He scoffed and shook his head. "No, I'd say I'm not too keen on it." "Well, I would have thought most disciples enjoy meditating." "Well, I'm not most disciples." "But that's the secret of divine powers, isn't it?" Leth pressed. "The meditation, I mean." "Divine powers?" "You know." The messenger waved his hand. "Heavenly magic, the favor of your goddess. I've heard your high-ranking disciples can do anything from healing the wounded to leveling cities." "You do that by meditating, right?" "It doesn't work like that," Darcon replied defensively. "You don't just sit down and ask Celestriona to share her strength. The connection comes slowly. You need to work to forge it." "Do you believe that?" whispered a small voice in the back of his mind. "Do you really believe that?" As if in response, his battered knuckles throbbed idly. They entered the dormitory, which was even darker than the courtyard. All the filigree and sheen of the observatory were gone, replaced by somber stone and creeping shadows. Orb-like lamps hung from the ceiling, casting the two of them in a sickly, faltering light, making the darkness shift and dance silently to the tune of their echoing footsteps, as the incandescent spheres swayed and jostled in the still air. This was more than a place for young initiates. It was a place for secrets. Darcon stopped for a moment and cleared his throat. Leth's questions still nagged at him, along with the memory of his failure at the tournament. "Why do you ask?" he inquired, turning to the man. "Are you hoping to become a clergy member someday? I'm not sure any sects will take you at your age." "I hear the Church of Dryerweep, who doesn't care what age you join," Leth replied as they walked. "The older you are, the closer you are to death, the more interested they are in taking you." Darcon shivered. Was it just him, or had the lights dimmed in here for a moment? Words carried power, especially in places like this. "Don't say that name in here," he hissed, coming to a stop. "So sorry," the courier responded, holding up his hands. "I didn't mean any offense. I didn't know He caught himself before making the same mistake. "I didn't know that name was offensive to you. I'm sorry." A moment passed. The orbs continued their gentle swaying. Darcon relaxed. Perhaps it had just been in his head after all. "It's all right," he replied, a little sheepish. "The name itself isn't offensive, but you shouldn't talk about him around here. He's the god of death and entropy. Everything that Celestriona is not. You know that, right?" "I thought they were brother and sister and Pantheon." "They are," Darcon acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean there can't be a family squabble." Celestriona and Dryerweep had done battle since before the first stars appeared in the sky, or the earliest dragons flapped their wings. Life and death, light and darkness, one could not exist without the other, but coexistence was impossible, like mixing oil and water. Just thinking about the conflict made gooseflesh crawl down his arms. Dryerweep had many messengers. His whispers were as cunning as they were dangerous, designed to sow chaos in the minds of the weak. Darcon could not, would not, be weak. His voice hardened. "Celestriona is life and power, represented by the living stars and all the movements of the heavens," he recited. "Her light shields us from his darkness." Shaking his head as if he had been brought out of a trance, Darcon turned on his heel and resumed leading his charge down the cold hallway. "If all of Celestriona temples are so beautiful," Leth suggested, "maybe I should join one of them instead." Darcon blew out a sigh, shrugging his shoulders in chagrin. "You're welcome to try. If it were really that simple to move mountains and command the divine, everyone would do it. Believe me, this is not a fun life." He paused. "Or an easy one." The corridor seemed to grow narrower as they continued. the length of the building passing dozens of small cells where each of the junior initiates slept and studied. No plush beds and silk sheets for them. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on them from all angles. Sometimes the austerity and isolation were too much to bear, prompting him to wonder whether he had been better suited to one of Heavenfall's many other religions, with their towering city cathedrals and extravagant masses. At last, they arrived outside a nondescript door, one of several, all nearly identical to one another. Darcon pulled it open, revealing his own sparsely furnished room. The space was cramped, containing nothing more than a cot, a chair, and a small table situated by the window. Sitting on top of it was a massive sheet of worn parchment, easily 2 feet from top to bottom and 3 feet wide. It bore an intricate illustration of the sky's unique constellation patterns on the day Darcon arrived at the monastery, rendered in painstaking detail. The intricacies were truly impressive, encompassing every named planet, every moon, and every star cluster within view of the telescope. Leth's eyes had gone wide, but when he saw Darcon watching him, he cleared his throat, putting on an unimpressed expression. "Is that it?" "What did you expect?" Darcon replied. "A magical shifting window to the stars, a portal on paper, it's a scroll." His disillusionment was shining through, but he didn't care. "So there's really nothing more to it?" Darcon crossed his arms. "I'm told the process of making the paper and ink is mystical in nature," he acknowledged. "I could swear some of the stars come and go when I'm not looking." He shook his head, back to fingering the scroll in his hand. It might as well have weighed a ton. "I'm sure there's powerful magic involved then," Leth said, and the look in his eyes told Darcon that he meant it. "Thank you for the tour, for letting me see it." "You're welcome. But if you don't mind..." Darcon trailed off, doing his best to make it clear he was ready to be alone with his brother's message. "Actually," Leth replied, "would you mind if I stayed a while longer? Maybe get that meal your master offered me." He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the letter. "Bryggon mentioned there may be extra money for me in sending a return message, if you want me to bring him one." "Really?" Darcon blinked. He hadn't been expecting this. There couldn't possibly be enough paper to tell his brother everything he wanted to. "I mean, yes, of course." He fumbled about for a moment, mind erasing. "If I could just have some time to work on it." "Absolutely," Leth said, holding up a hand. "Take all the time you need. I'll just make my way down to the kitchen while I wait. That's all right?" Darcon nodded, his mood lifting. "Great. Perfect. I'll draft something up and find you when it's done. Just, don't advertise that you're running around by yourself. Head straight to the dining hall, and I'll find you there when I'm done. I've gotten in enough trouble for one day." Leth gave a broad smile and nodded in agreement. Darcon all but shooed the corridor out of his bedroom cell, closing the door behind him. Finally free from prying eyes, he strode over to his desk, itching with anticipation, and more than a hint of unease. "Don't think like that," he told himself. Nothing bad had happened. There was only one way to find out. Plopping down on his stool, he scrambled to unroll the parchment with a feverishness that could only stem from suspense. The message was there in Bryggon's characteristic, crisp lettering. It was long enough to take up the entire page as Darcon smoothed it out over the desk. There was something else as well, something marked on the upper right-hand corner. A detailed series of interlocking loops in green ink, forming a dizzying shape. Although Darcon was no mage, he recognized a glyph when he saw one. He didn't have a chance to finish the thought, unconscious before he hit the floor.